Greetings and welcome to From the Basement. In this video series, we're going to take a look at recreating the Evil Clutches project from the GameMaker's Apprentice, Chapter 2. I personally prefer to call this the Dragon Project because, well, dragons are awesome. If you disagree, you're wrong. Okay, so what happens if you don't have the resources from the GameMaker's Apprentice? The book didn't come with it, CD was broken, what have you. Lots of reasons. Well, the resource CD is fairly easy to get. If you go to the internet and do a search for the GameMaker's Apprentice CD download, you should find a link to the Apprentice site for the book. And down towards the bottom, under the Source Code and Downloads tab, you will find a Download Now link that contains all of the resources that was on the book's CD. Also, if you happen to be enrolled in Game 105, you should be able to go into the Desire to Learn course, go to the links area, and there will be a direct link to the GameMaker CD resources, which is the Apprentice website. Okay, now before we dive in creating stuff, I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the process of creating a game. Before you actually sit down and start creating assets and game logic and gameplay and such, you need to have a plan. I know it's horribly cliche, but if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. This is very phenomenally true with games. Games are really complex. The ones we're doing in these chapters, not so much, but anything much past that, and yeah, they start getting kind of twisty and snarly and stuff, and if you don't have a plan, it's gonna become a mess. And now, the exception to this of always have a plan before you start is if you really don't know what you're wanting to do yet and you're just experimenting. That's called prototyping, and we have a course specifically for that. That's not what we're concerned with right now. Right now, we're concerned with creating a game. We need a plan, also better known as a design document. Now, in the case of these projects from the GameMaker's Apprentice, we do have a design document. It's called the chapter. Every chapter in the GameMaker's Apprentice that deals with a specific project is basically the design document for that game. It tells us what our art assets need to be. It tells us what our sound assets need to be. It tells us how fast things are supposed to move, how many of things that we need. It's basically a design document with a couple of extra screenshots thrown in to show you how to actually do it in the engine. So we'll be using that as our design document, but just sort of to recap, to make sure that we're in line with what we want to be doing. For the Dragon project, we've got two main characters that will always be on the screen, the Mother Dragon and the Big Boss Demon. The Big Boss Demon has stolen the Mother Dragon's hatchlings, and she really doesn't like that, and she wants her hatchlings back. The Boss Demon and Dragon will be on opposite ends of the screen, horizontally, so left and right sides of the screen. During gameplay, the Boss Demon will simply bounce up and down between the top and bottom of the screen. Periodically, the Boss Demon will spawn smaller demons that will fly across the screen that the dragon either needs to fireball or dodge. Or the player, I guess I should say, needs to fireball or dodge. And will occasionally spawn baby dragons that the player needs to not fireball. Very bad parenting to fireball your children. And preferably catch the little baby dragons. The player controls will use the arrow keys to move up and down on the left-hand side of the screen, and the space bar to fire the fireballs. No special actions needed to catch the baby dragons, you just run into them with your dragon sprite. Okay, so that is our starting point. So let's go ahead and get working on getting the Boss Demon and the Mother Dragon set up. Now we've got a couple of different ways that we can load in our sprites. We could go up to Resources and do Create Sprite. We could do a Shift-Control-S. We could click on the little Pac-Man looking like symbol on the toolbar. Or, my personal favorite and the way you will almost always see me create resources of any type, right-click on the resource folder and say Create. First things first, let's give a name. I'm going to call this SPR Dragon because I'm going to load my dragon sprite into this. Now, why did I put that SPR in front of it? Well, a couple of reasons for that. First reason, and probably sort of the harshest, you can't violate this reason, is that GameMaker will not allow any two resources to share the same name. So if I have a sprite dragon and a game object dragon, GameMaker will yell at me and not let me do that. The game will not run. Also, not so much for this course since we're doing all drag and drop, but when you start dealing with scripting, it becomes useful to know, am I referring to a sprite or am I referring to a game object? The way I handle that is for anything other than objects, I always put a little prefix, and this is called Hungarian notation in programmer speak, to indicate what exactly is this variable. Because GameMaker, especially the scripting language, is really kind of fast and loose with what type of information you can pass around in functions. So it's really useful to know, okay, well, if I see a SPR, that means it's a sprite. If I see an SFX or a BGM, then I know sound effects or background music. If I see a P, I know that stands for a path. If I see an SCR, I know that stands for a script, so on and so forth. You get the idea. So I'm going to call this Sprite Dragon. I'm going to go to Load Sprite, and I'm going to choose the dragon image. Now, I've already been playing around a little bit with this, so it already knew exactly where to go for this. Depending on your setup, you'll have different places to look for this. If you are on campus, then you will go to the student drive, which I believe is currently mapped to W, and go to the game folder, and there will be a GameMaker folder. Just keep drilling down, and eventually you'll find the GameMaker resources, Chapter 2 folder. If you're working from a home computer, it's wherever you downloaded and extracted out the CD contents to. So we're in Chapter 2, the dragon. Now, you'll notice, by default, this is how it'll look. You'll have this nice solid blue background. That would look really ugly, so we need to make sure that we remove background. Now, if you use the remove background feature, loading in a sprite, what it'll do is it'll take the lower leftmost pixel and it'll say, oh, okay, well, that's the color I'm supposed to remove. So you got to make sure that you leave that lower leftmost pixel the right color. Also, GameMaker now is very good about reading transparency information that is in PNG files. And so if the image already has the transparency information built into it, you do not need to do remove background. I'm going to go ahead and click on open. And now I can see my dragon, and I know I've removed the background properly because I've got this little checkerboard pattern behind the dragon. That is the indication for transparency. In fact, pretty much almost every program uses it. GIMP uses it. I'm fairly certain Adobe Photoshop uses it. And GameMaker's Sprite Editor uses this to indicate transparency. Now, let's look at some of our other properties here. Width 135, height 150. That is the number of pixels that our image has. Every image has a resolution or fixed number of pixels that makes up that image. Once an image is created at a certain resolution, that is the maximum resolution you can have. Yes, I can technically scale this up if I wanted to, but there's no more detail there to be rendered. And so if I scale it up, I'm going to start getting what are called artifacts in my image. Blurriness, jaggies, what have you. It's not going to look good. So that is pretty much my fixed resolution right there for my image. Number of sub-images, 6. That tells me that there are 6 sub-images associated with this. If I click on Edit Sprite, I can see all 6 sub-images. We'll come back to those in a little bit more detail in future videos and projects. Just know that that is how the animation is handled. Origin is an interesting one. It's currently at 0, 0. If I click on center, you can see that I've got this little crosshair thing that snaps to the center of the image. And if I click and drag here, I drag the crosshair around and I also change my origin. Now, this has its roots back in the old CRT days, But 0, 0 is in the upper left-hand corner. This is because back in the really, really old school monitors that used scan lines to draw the image, the scan lines would start in the upper left-hand corner of the TV or the screen. And so the upper left-hand corner is 0, 0. This isn't going to be overly tricky in this project, but in future projects we're going to have to pay very close attention to the fact that 0, 0 is in the upper left-hand corner. It is not in the center. The rest of the settings we will take a look at in detail later. Defaults are fine. So I will click on the green OK. It's important to click on the check mark, not the X. Clicking on the X will prompt you, do you want to save changes? If I was to click no at this point, I would lose all of the changes that I have made to this sprite. When I first started working with GameMaker, there was a couple of times that I cost myself, I think one time I cost myself, a full hour's worth of work. Because I think I had practically every single object and sprite open in the project. And I was like, okay, I need to clean this up. Close, 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 close. Clicking on the X, 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 save, no, X, save, no, save, no, save. Wait a minute. Uh-oh. And I had told it save no to the file that I was actually, the object that I was actually working on, instead of just experimenting with. So, my recommendation to you is never use this X unless you want to close out a window without saving the changes you have done. Otherwise, you just should get in the habit of always clicking on the green check mark. Notice that after I click on the green check mark, my name here updates. Excuse me. This is important for when we go to add our images into our objects. It might cause you some confusion if you see Sprite 1, Sprite 2, Sprite 3 when you're expecting image names. It won't actually update it for everything else to see until you click on that check mark. Let's go ahead and add in the daemon, or the boss daemon. So I'm going to do a create sprite, or right-click, create sprite, load sprite, boss. Again, I want to remove background. I do not want this brown background, so I want to remove it. I see my checkerboard pattern. Defaults are fine for everything else, and I'm going to call this SPR boss, not box. We do have boss boxes later on in the semester, but we haven't gotten to those yet. Again, notice as soon as at that time I hit the enter key, enter also works, and it automatically updated. Let's go ahead and get these objects created. So I'm going to create the boss first because he's pretty simple. Now I'm going to call my object just plain old boss. To set the sprite, I'm going to click where it says no sprite, left click, and it's going to bring me up a pop-down window that allows me to select any sprites that I currently have created. So I'm going to select my sprite boss. Now, key thing, or a key thing to remember when doing game development is computers are stupid. They are phenomenally stupid. They're going to do exactly what you tell them to do. No more, no less. So if we actually want this guy to do things, we have to tell it to do things. But how do we know when to tell it to do things? Well, that is the event system in GameMaker. An event is something that happens to an object. And then once that event has happened to the object, we can then use an action to make the object do something. So the first event that I want to tap into is the move event. So I'm going to, the create event. Because as soon as the game starts, as soon as this boss is created in our game, we want him to start moving. So I'm going to do add event and create. A create event is always ran when an object first gets created. So if an object is placed in the room in the editor, the instant the room starts, this create event is going to fire off on this boss. Now, I want it to move. Over here in our actions area, we have all different kinds of actions. We have a move tab, a main 1, main 2, control, score, extra, which may be blanked out depending on the version you have, and some draw functions. Obviously, I want to stay on the move tab, and for now I want to keep my movement fairly simple. So I'm going to drag over this green multi-way arrow. Make sure you get the green multi-way arrow. And I'm going to click on the up and down arrows. If you remember from Catch the Clown, when you click on multiple direction arrows on the moved fixed action, you are telling GameMaker randomly choose between all of the selected arrows. So sometimes I'll start going up, sometimes the boss will start going down. For my speed, I will set that to 8. A quick note about speed. Speed is pixels per step. You can think of a step as GameMaker's specific terminology for a frame. By default, GameMaker rooms will run at 30 steps or 30 frames per second. Keep that in mind, that is per second. So by saying a speed of 8 times 30 is 240, this object will move 240 pixels per second. You have got to keep that in mind, that this speed value is per step. And so whatever you put in here, if you're leaving everything at default for your room settings, multiply it by 30 and you get how fast you're moving per second. So speed 8 is quite sufficient for this guy. Click OK. Now remember, computers are dumb. We've told it to move, but we have never told it to stop moving when it hits the edge of the room and come back. We'll need another event for that. Now, the other has just all sorts of fun things in it. You might think it would be in collision, colliding with the edge of the room. No. Well, you could technically do it that way, but it'd be really complicated and convoluted. But instead, we want to go to other. Other has all sorts of fun things, like intersect boundary. And what that event says is the moment a single non-transparent pixel, the non-transparent part's important, the moment a single non-transparent pixel hits the edge of this room, we're going to trigger this event. And what we want to do is reverse our vertical direction. And we'll just take all of the defaults, we'll get to those later, and we're done. Now the boss will go up, hit the edge, bounce down, hit the edge, bounce up, hit the edge, so on, so forth. Now, let's test to make sure that our boss is actually working. Now, I'm not going to close this window out just sort of to illustrate my point of this name here will not change until I close out this window. Let's create a room. A room in GameMaker is kind of like your screens. You'll have a room for your title screen, a room for each level, possibly, a room for your end game screen, maybe a room for your inventory screen, depending on how complicated it is. Rooms are your screens, your levels. If you want an object to actually do something, it has to be placed in a room. And now for the moment, we'll just ignore most of the settings. And instead, we're just going to go straight in here to Objects. And notice when I go to select my boss, he's still called Object 1. Again, that's the point I was making. The name won't update until you close that window. So if I come back over here to my object and click OK, and now come back over here, notice now I get to see a preview of it, and it's called Boss now. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can place things. If you look down below, you will see all of the keyboard shortcuts for placing things. I don't need to worry about a grid on this particular one, so I'm going to use the Alt for no snap. So I'm going to press and hold Alt, left click, and drag that guy right up to the edge, roughly center in the screen. Yep, and I wasn't... By the way, you can also use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out, and middle mouse wheel, as it says right there, is a scroll. So that looks pretty good. And for the sake of iteration and testing, even though the book doesn't say test it yet, I want to go ahead and test this. So I'm going to close out my room, I'm going to hit the play button and verify that everything is working. And yay, it is. The boss demon is peacefully bouncing up and down between the boundaries of the room. Now this video's hit about the 20-minute mark, so I'm going to go ahead and break things off here, close out this video, and in the next video we'll start taking a look at how to set up the player. Until then.